Honestly, never seen anything like that. No.
Welcome to episode 33 of the Horror Double Bill, the podcast where each week we pair two movies to create something far greater than the sum of their parts. I'm Craig Johnson, and this week we are exploring nihilism, urban decay, paranoia, identity, and societal collapse, with two rather unusual police procedurals. First up, we have David Fincher Se7en from 1995, starring Brad Pitt, Morgan Freeman and Gwyneth Paltrow. Then we head across to Tokyo for our first Japanese movie of the series, with Cure from 1997, directed by Kiyoshi Kurosawa. This stars Kōji Yakusho, Anna Nakagawa and Masato Hagiwara. Along the way, we'll be exploring the early careers of writer Andrew Kevin Walker, directors David Fincher and Kiyoshi Kurosawa, and much, much more. But before we do any of that though, as always, I'd just like to mention the key sources that I've used in researching this week's episode. So, when discussing Seven, I have referred to the book Seven by Richard Dyer, which is published as part of the BFI Films Classics series, the director's commentary on the movie, which is available on the Warner Blu-ray release, and interviews with Andrew Kevin Walker, David Fincher, Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman, that can be found on the websites letterboxd.com, theguardian.com, andrewkevinwalker.com, thecinemen.com, and the latimes.com. And when discussing Cure, I have referred to the book Cure, written by Dominic Lash, which again is published by the BFI Film Classics series, interviews and special features on the Blu-ray Masters of Cinema release from Eureka Entertainment, the book, The Films of Kiyoshi Kurosawa, Master of Fear by Jerry White, and interviews with Kiyoshi Kurosawa on the websites /film.com, dvdtalk.com, fangoria.com, and limitarevista.com. And for both movies, I have also referred to multiple interviews with the cast and directors that can be found on YouTube, all of which will be listed and linked in the show notes. All of which brings us on to our first movie of the week, which, as I mentioned at the top of the show, is Seven, directed by David Fincher and written by Andrew Kevin Walker. This stars Brad Pitt, Morgan Freeman and Gwyneth Paltrow. And we are going to get into the spoilers pretty early in this week's episode, including revealing the identity of the killer and the shock ending. So, as always, if you have yet to see the movie, please proceed with all due caution for the rest of this week's podcast. As I mentioned at the end of last week's episode, I wasn't entirely sure whether we could reasonably classify Seven as a horror movie, and to be honest, it probably sits more firmly and comfortably in the idea of neo-noir. However, I'm happy to say that in my research for this week's episode, I discovered that both writer Andrew Kevin Walker and David Fincher have indeed described it as a horror. Fincher has said that the movie is a horror movie and is about utter and total loss of control, going on to expand on this in an interview on letterboxd.com, saying, quote, "I just felt that if we could do it smart and sharp and committed, then it would have a chance to be a grungy horror movie masquerading as a thriller," end quote. Writer Andrew Kevin Walker, in an interview on thecinemen.com, defined the movie as both a horror film and a cop potboiler, though he did go on to say that he actually tends to work out the genre of his screenplays almost at the end of the writing process, to avoid trying to pack them with convention and cliché. Whether you agree with the definitions or not is entirely up to you, but I think it's certainly true to say that Seven, whether classified as a thriller, police procedural, or neo-noir, is certainly horrifying, and its success laid the way for a plethora of movies, most of which seem to fit far more firmly into the horror camp. These include 1999's Resurrection, starring Christopher Lambert, Robert Joy, and, surprisingly, David Cronenberg, 2007's W Delta Z, starring Melissa George, Tom Hardy, and Stellan Skarsgård, Untraceable from 2008, starring Diane Lane and Colin Hanks, and of course Saw from 2004, written by Leigh Whannell and directed by James Wan. On more than one occasion, Whannell has name-checked Fincher's movie as an influence on the first film in the franchise, and in a GQ interview, called it a recurrent reference point, comparing its beauty and griminess to a Renaissance painting of something awful. He also spoke incredibly favourably about the script, calling it a perfect engine with an inevitable terrible ending, and went on to describe his own screenplay for Saw as, quote, a 23-year-old doing their best impression of Seven, end quote. On the other hand, director James Wan seems to have grown a little tired of the comparisons, though this seems to be a little more to do with the greater freedom that Fincher had to film multiple takes, more of which a little bit later. That being said, Michael Chavez, who directed 2021's The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It, has also name-checked the film as a reference point, saying in an interview at the time of the movie's release that one suggested that their film should be, quote-unquote, Seven for the Conjuring universe. The influence of the film, from its opening credits to its narrative, cinematography, and score, continues to this day, which isn't bad going for a film in which Fincher was less than confident. In a Letterboxd interview, he said that he felt he had to continually apologise to the cast, advising both Pitt and Freeman that Seven would end up being a footnote movie, and that it was hardly going to be the type of film that would end up on their headstones. Seven was the brainchild of writer Andrew Kevin Walker, who also has a very brief cameo in the film as the corpse in the very first crime scene, a domestic murder investigated by Detective Lieutenant Somerset, played by Morgan Freeman. Born in 1964 in Altoona, Pennsylvania, Walker studied film production at Penn State University, from where he graduated in 1986 with a Bachelor of Arts in Film and Video. After graduating, he moved to New York and began working for incredibly low-budget film production companies, studios that he described in later interviews as being even lower budget than Troma Films, the home of the Toxic Avenger. During this period, he also wrote his first New York screenplay, a film called Brain Scan, which centered around a VHS tape that induces hypnotic suggestion. Although the company that had originally purchased the script went bust, the screenplay itself ended up being picked up and developed, with a few changes, into a film that was released in 1994, starring Edward Furlong and Frank Langella, a resurrection that Walker says took him completely by surprise. But, as you can imagine, working for a low-budget film studio as a production assistant didn't exactly pay the bills. So, after a while, he got a job at Tower Records, all while crafting screenplays that he hoped would allow him, as he put it, to, quote-unquote, write his way out of here. And while he may not have been too enamoured with the day job, his time in the city at least presented him with the backdrop for the screenplay that would eventually become Seven, a place that he says came as a real culture shock for a young man from the suburbs of Pennsylvania. Quote, I was in New York from 86 to 91, so it was the height of a lot of NYC-specific stuff, like the crack cocaine epidemic being on the rise. It was very different from the way it is now. For example, you would never go to Times Square without being very careful. End quote. The screenplay that he developed then was very much a reaction to this urban environment, a place where you could walk down the street and, according to Walker, see every deadly sin on every street corner. This led him to ask himself, what if somebody was so hypersensitively attuned to these injustices? And that's where the idea of murder by the 7 deadly sins originated. This perspective of a world full of sin and vice is best described by the killer John Doe in his monologue following his surrender, when he responds to Detective Mills' claim that the victims were innocent people. Quote, "An obese man, a disgusting man who could barely stand up. A man who, if you saw him on the street, you'd point him out to your friends so that they could join you in mocking him. A man who, if you saw him while you were eating, you wouldn't be able to finish your meal. And after him, I picked the lawyer, a man who dedicated his life to making money by lying with every breath he could muster to keep murderers and rapists on the street. A woman so ugly on the inside that she couldn't bear to go on living if she couldn't be beautiful on the outside. A drug dealer, a drug-dealing pederast, actually. And let's not forget the disease-spreading whore." End quote. Savage stuff indeed, and a monologue which highlights not only the killer's worldview and motivations, but also, to some extent, the hypocrisy of modern society. This concept was very much driven by exploitation cinema, much like the ones created at the studios where he had been working, an experience that also gave him the ability to write a good elevator pitch. This is essentially a 1 or 2 sentence description that helps explain the movie, something that was essential to ensure that his screenplay stood out in the sea of scripts that were submitted to film companies every day. Walker has said that from the moment he settled on the idea of 7 deadly sin murders, he knew that the climax of the movie would involve the investigating officer becoming the sin of wrath, giving him the perfect tagline, 7 deadly sin murders, and the cop becomes the 7th deadly sin. Or something like that, anyway. The film takes place in an unnamed city, a place with no defined geographic location that could be New York, could be LA, or indeed could be pretty much any city in the United States. As Walker likes to joke, it could even be your town. The narrative centres around 2 detectives, Somerset, played by Morgan Freeman, who is approaching retirement and who has clearly been burned out by years of working on the force, and Mills, played by Brad Pitt, an enthusiastic, idealistic, and rather temperamental younger detective who has been reassigned to the city, at his own request, from a much quieter and safer location. So far, so predictable, with the mismatched cop trope being a staple of cinema for decades. Possibly the earliest example of this trope can be found in Akira Kurosawa's 1949 movie Stray Dog. This features a rookie younger detective partnered with a more seasoned veteran, and with its 2 contrasting characters with different motivations, is seen as a precursor to the many, many, many films that followed. Other examples include 1967's multi-Oscar winning In the Heat of the Night. This stars Sidney Poitier and Rod Steiger investigating murder and racial prejudice in small-town Mississippi. On a far less serious note, though, we also have James Caan and Alan Arkin in 1974's Freebie and the Bean, 1987's Lethal Weapon, starring Mel Gibson and Danny Glover, Stakeout, starring Richard Dreyfuss and Emilio Estevez, which was also released in 1987, Rush Hour from 1998, starring Jackie Chan and Chris Tucker, and 1989's Tango and Cash, starring Kurt Russell and Sylvester Stallone. With such a plethora of films coming out in quick succession in the mid-1980s, and some of these were of very questionable quality, by this point the trope had become less of a trope and more of a cliché. It's little wonder then that both David Fincher and Brad Pitt lost interest in reading the Seven screenplay after the first few pages, and had to be encouraged to read further, believing that the script was nothing new, original, or interesting. And then, of course, they read further and were proven wrong. Following their initial meeting, Somerset and Mills are assigned to what at first seems like a routine murder, a rather brutal one, but nothing particularly unusual, at least in this city. Someone had a problem with the fat guy and decided to torture him, says the chief of police, going on to describe the crime itself as being simple. But this is then immediately followed by another, far more high-profile murder, that of a wealthy lawyer killed in his luxurious offices. On further investigation, Somerset, and then Mills, realise that the two crimes are linked, and that someone out there is killing people as a tribute to the 7 deadly sins. The number 7 acts as a talisman for the film, with many of the major plot points falling into its numerical orbit. There are, of course, the 7 deadly sins: gluttony, greed, sloth, pride, lust, envy, and wrath, and the narrative occurs over a 7-day period, with Somerset just a week away from a very well-deserved retirement. The culmination of Killer John Doe's plan occurs at 7:01 p.m, something that he refers to as close, and there are many other references to the number throughout the movie. These include street numbers that are passed by Somerset and Mills when they meet for the first time and walk down the street, and even the number on the door of Somerset's old office is 714, which can essentially be said to depict the number 7 3 times, with 14, of course, being 7 multiplied by 2. There have been many articles and essays written about the significance of the number, but for Walker, it was about trying to portray a certain symmetry in the movie. And strangely enough, this symmetry extended beyond the structure of the film and into the real world, with the movie ranking as the 7th highest grossing film of the year on its release in 1995. At first, Somerset wants to keep his distance from the case, though he is intrigued enough by the puzzle to spend a night doing research in the public library, a beautifully photographed sequence in which he seems almost adrift in a sea of green lamps, all accompanied by the composition of Johann Sebastian Bach. This scene gives us a clue to Somerset's character, a man who is intrigued by detail and who cannot resist the cerebral nature of the killer's puzzle. And indeed, once he had come up with the central conceit of the film, Walker himself began an extensive period of research, something that he says was similar to the way in which Somerset researches in the public library, though he has also admitted that in reality he is probably closer to Mills in terms of his reliance on cliff notes. This research included many of the references that are found by Somerset in the library. First of all, we have St. Thomas Aquinas, who was not only canonized as a saint, but was also a theologian and a philosopher. Aquinas' philosophy was that reason and faith are not contradictory pathways to truth, but are instead complementary, and he also provided a systematic and extensive analysis of the 7 deadly sins, assessing the nature of the sin itself, and also the additional sins to which each one gives birth, calling the secondary sins, quote-unquote, daughters. Walker also researched Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, which were written at the end of the 14th century, and was particularly inspired by the Parson's Tale, in which the character of the parson delivers a lengthy sermon on the nature of sin, defining each one, and suggesting specific remedies for each. And perhaps most importantly, there is also Dante's Purgatorio, which forms the second part of the 14th century poem The Divine Comedy, written by Dante Alighieri. Following on from the first part, Inferno, in which Dante, guided by the Roman poet Virgil, explores the 9 circles of hell, Purgatorio tells of a climb up the mountain of Purgatory, a mountain which is divided into 3 sections. The bottom section, which commentators have named Ante-Purgatory, is for the excommunicated and the late repentant, while the second section, importantly for this film, consists of 7 terraces that represent suffering and spiritual growth, each of which is associated with one of the 7 deadly sins. The third section is earthly paradise, or the Garden of Eden, the state of innocence that existed before Adam and Eve's fall from grace. It is from here that we get the idea that John Doe is working his way up the sins to achieve a state of innocence, though in Dante's work these sins are in a rather different order than in the final movie, beginning with pride and then moving through envy, wrath, sloth, avarice or greed, gluttony, and then finally lust. But although these sins are not in exactly the same order, the metaphor becomes pretty clear, or at least it does to Somerset, and this metaphor is also captured in the note found behind the refrigerator in the gluttony victim's residence. Quote, "Long is the way, and hard, that out of hell leads up to the light." End quote. This is a quotation from Milton's Paradise Lost, an epic poem relating to the biblical fall of man, and there are many other literary references too. For example, Eli Gould, the defense attorney, bleeds to death after cutting off a pound of his own flesh, a direct reference to Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice, in which the moneylender Shylock demands a pound of flesh as payment for a debt. And this is something that we'll be discussing in more depth next week, but more on that at the end of the show. John Doe, then, is certainly well read, but not only this, he is also a writer, as we see when Mills and Somerset find his apartment midway through the film and discover the many journals he has written and constructed detailing his fanaticism. And this is not the first time that we get to see these books. The opening credits depict their creation, a sequence which, according to Fincher, depicts not only the killer's fetishization, but also anticipates how brutal and nasty things are going to get. This title sequence was highly unusual for the time, and came about very much through Fincher's desire to push against convention. Told that to film the opening title cards they would need a pin-registered camera to ensure stability, he asked himself, and the crew, why things had to be stable, and why the text couldn't shudder and move as much as the images that accompanied it. Given that this technique has, as Brad Pitt has mentioned, subsequently appeared in about 8 million different adverts and 17 films, it's hard to remember how groundbreaking it was at the time, but groundbreaking it most certainly was. I remember seeing the film at the cinema when it was first released, and immediately being disorientated by what was being presented, demonstrating the result that Fincher was ultimately looking for, an audience thrown off balance, and watching something that, in his own words, was a little bit fucked up. And, incidentally, the decision to accompany this juddering text with a montage of John Doe making his books was suggested by one of the crew, who pointed out that as it had cost $15,000 to make them, and as they were so beautiful, it would be a shame to limit them just to the one scene in John Doe's apartment. Although Somerset is initially more than reluctant to get involved in the case, all of this changes when he is invited for dinner by Mill's wife, Tracy, played by Gwyneth Paltrow. In the Blu-ray commentary, Morgan Freeman suggests that this is the pivotal moment of the film, not just in terms of the investigation, but also in Somerset's relationship with Mills. The two detectives are brought together because of her. Tracy effectively humanizes Mills, shifting him in Somerset's perception away from the annoying know-it-all cop who crassly declares we have a murder in the city mortuary. Rather ironically, given what is to come later, Tracy has given up her former life as a teacher in what we can assume is a quieter and safer location, and moved to the nameless city to support her husband's ambitions and also his idealism. This idealism is underpinned by her nickname for him of Serpico, the title of a novel and an Al Pacino movie from 1973 about a good cop fighting against corruption in the NYPD. This is perhaps less of a nickname and more of an epithet, attributing a characteristic to Mills at the start of the film and setting him up as both an idealist and also somewhat anti-establishment. Following dinner with Tracy, the two detectives discover a break in the case of the murdered lawyer, bringing Somerset fully into the investigation, and from then on, the hunt for the killer continues. There are, of course, more murders, including the Pride and, notoriously, the Lust murder, which is described by Walker himself as heinous. And then, surprisingly, John Doe turns himself in, covered in blood that we later realise is Tracy's, given that he has only just murdered her to represent the sin of envy. The capture of John Doe, with about 15 minutes left of the film, is what most intrigued David Fincher, and is the thing which, brutality of the murders aside, set the screenplay apart from the usual buddy cop thriller, which normally climaxes, of course, with the killer's capture. Fincher has recalled being taken aback, flicking through the script, and wondering what could possibly happen in the next 20 pages when the screenplay had already given what would traditionally be the climax. The answer, of course, is plenty, with a downbeat and brutal ending that was criticised by many at the time for being too harsh. Barry Norman, the BBC film critic in 1995, complained that the bleak climax was too hard on viewers and deprived them of the final comfort that he felt they fully deserved. And he was not the only person who held this viewpoint. In fact, it is really by sheer chance and the persistence of producer Michael DeLuca, as well as David Fincher, Brad Pitt, Morgan Freeman, and Kevin Spacey, that this is indeed the way the film ended. Once Walker had completed his first draft, he cold-called a screenwriter called David Koepp, who at that point had written a handful of scripts, but would go on to write the screenplays for, among others, Carlito's Way and Jurassic Park, both released in 1993. Proving the adage that a rising tide lifts all ships, Koepp not only took the call, but also read Walker's screenplay, suggested some tweaks, and then sent it across to his agent. From here, it was optioned for director Jeremiah Chechik, a Canadian best known at the time for National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation, which is about as far removed from the screenplay for Seven as you can possibly get. Chechik had a number of rewrites, including changes to the ending, and Walker, keen to make an impression and new to the ways of Hollywood, went along with all of the requests, something that he later said he would never ever do again. In the Chechik version, there is certainly no head in a box at the ending, and other changes were so extensive that the writer has said he thanks God that this version of the film was never made, as it would have led to a very different career path for him afterwards. When the option period ran out, the screenplay found its way to New Line Cinema, who sent it out to directors' agents, one of whom represented David Fincher. However, a very fortunate error meant that the draft Fincher received was the first one, head in a box ending and all, and this was something that he was greatly impressed by. When Fincher started discussing the screenplay with New Line Cinema, they realised their error and sent the Chechik version, which Fincher didn't like at all, and insisted that he would only direct the film if they went back to the original draft and the original downbeat ending. It's hardly surprising, then, that Walker credits Fincher's input and decision with both saving the movie and also changing the trajectory of his subsequent career. Not that it was all plain sailing from here. Studio executives were still incredibly nervous about the climax all the way through the filming and even into post-production, suggesting alternatives that, in hindsight, seem ridiculous in the extreme. At one point, it was even suggested that the box should contain the severed head of one of Mills's dogs, which, given the popularity of websites like doesthedogdie.com, probably would have caused more outrage than the final filmed outcome. At this stage, I would normally give a full biography and filmography of the director that I'm discussing, but I suspect it's probably a given that everybody listening to this podcast knows who David Fincher is, and also the majority, if not all, of his movies. Also, this week, I am trying, and I suspect failing rather miserably, to keep this episode at a more comfortable length, and given the nature of Fincher's career, to even attempt a full biography and filmography would make last week's marathon episode feel like a TikTok video. Suffice to say, he is probably one of, if not the most, highly regarded and influential directors of his generation, with a career spanning over 35 years and with 12 feature films under his belt, as well as several TV shows, including the greatly missed Mindhunter. But, that being said, I will at least discuss the beginning of his career here, up to the making and release of Seven, which changed the trajectory of his filmmaking life as much as it did Walker's. David Fincher was born in 1962 in Denver, Colorado, though his family moved to California when he was 2 years old. His mother was a mental health nurse who worked in drug addiction programs, and his father was an author who also worked as a reporter and bureau chief for Life magazine. Like many of the filmmakers we have discussed in this series, he became fascinated with cinema at a very early age, and began making films on an 8mm camera when he was just 8 years old. He reflected on this in a 2012 interview, saying, quote, "I saw a documentary on the making of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. It had never occurred to me that movies didn't take place in real time. I knew that they were fake, I knew that the people were acting, but it had never occurred to me that it could take 4 months to make a movie. It never occurred to me that there were hours between each of the shots. The actual circus of it was invisible, as it should be, but in seeing that, I became obsessed with the idea of how. It was the ultimate magic trick. The notion that 24 still photographs are shown in such quick succession that movement is imparted from it. And I thought that there would never be anything that would be as interesting as that to do with the rest of my life." End quote. In high school, he became involved with theatre groups, directing plays, designing sets, and operating lighting. He also worked as a projectionist at a local movie theatre and as a production assistant at the local news station. He was also very much in the right place at the right time. His family counted George Lucas as a neighbour, and he was surrounded by film crews making movies. Because he was surrounded by the film industry, he made the decision to not attend film school, saying later, rather self-deprecatingly, that the only film school he was interested in, because he wasn't very bright, was USC, and there, every film that you made, USC ended up owning. Given that the fees were, at the time, $35,000 a year, he didn't think it wise to pay to have someone else own his movies, and so instead found a job at Industrial Light and Magic. He worked at ILM for 3 years, including on George Lucas's Return of the Jedi, joking that he made the tanks that tried to kill the Ewoks, and that this was his personal contribution to cinema. From here, he started making music videos, something that allowed him to hone his craft. During this time, he made videos for artists including George Michael, Michael Jackson, Billy Idol, Aerosmith, 9 Inch Nails, and Madonna, saying in later interviews that MTV, rest in peace, was the only film school that he really needed. And I have to say, if you want to get a sense of a man growing in his artistry, even if you're not a fan of Madonna, I highly recommend watching the Fincher-directed videos for her songs Oh Father and Bad Girl, the latter of which contains a transition that is quite honestly truly spectacular. He founded the company Propaganda Films, made commercials and more music videos, and then was given the opportunity to direct his first feature, saying, quote, "I'd been doing commercials and videos for 8 or 10 years before anybody gave me a shot at making a movie, and I wish they hadn't." End quote. This movie was Alien 3, an experience that he has described as a baptism by fire, made worse by his rather naive assumption that everyone involved in the film industry wants to make the movie as good as they possibly can. By all accounts, it was a thoroughly miserable experience for him, working on it for 2 years, being fired off it 3 times, and having to fight for every single decision. There are plenty of articles online detailing his experience making Alien 3, so I'm not going to go into it here. But before I move on, I will let him have the final word on the subject, saying that, at the time, quote, "No one hated it more than me, and to this day, no one hates it more than me." End quote. Following this, he went back to music videos and commercials, always figuring that there were plenty of people who had made a worse film than him, understatement of the year, and so thought that he would at least get one more shot. And this is when his agent sent him the script for Seven. Once he read the screenplay, he met with New Line executive Michael DeLuca, who we discussed last week, and the two had a conversation that Fincher has recounted as follows. Quote, "I said that I really liked the first draft and not the 13th draft, and he said, me too. So I asked what he was going to do, and I was laying out what I wanted to do on it. And he said, close the door, and then he said, look, if we develop this and get into a dialogue about changes that could possibly be made to the material, there's no way we could make this version of it, because I'll have 15 people looking over my shoulder who are going to be reading all of the pages as they come in. But if you say that you'll make this movie starting in 6 weeks, we can make a version of the movie. So I said, okay, let's do it. Put the head in a box. And that's how the movie got made." End quote. And while we're on the subject of the infamous head in the box moment, for many years there has been a rumour circulated online that a replica head of actress Gwyneth Paltrow was cast for the movie, but that it was decided at the last moment to not use it. The rumour goes on to suggest that this very head was then used for Gwyneth Paltrow's character during the filming of the 2011 pandemic thriller Contagion. However, as it turns out, these rumours are not true and have been dismissed by Fincher himself. In a 2025 interview, he advised that there was never a fake head made, and that in reality the team researched to calculate what proportion of Gwyneth Paltrow's body mass index would be just her head. This calculation was then used to construct a shot bag, which was put inside the box to ensure that it was the correct weight. A blonde wig with a small amount of blood applied was then also added to the box, so that strands would adhere to the tape when the box was opened. And this approach certainly makes more sense. As the director himself put it, you don't really need to see what's in the box if you have Morgan Freeman. It would be unbelievably reductive of me to say that the cinematography and editing in Seven are beautiful, because I've yet to see a David Fincher film to which my admittedly overused adjective couldn't be applied. But needless to say, the imagery is beyond striking, displaying an artistry that many filmmakers have tried and failed to replicate. These include the glow of torches piercing through the gloom of the gluttony murder location, the framing of Mills behind a desk in the dead lawyer's office, crime scene photos reflected in Somerset's glasses. I could go on, but again, I am trying to keep this episode to a reasonable length. Part of this is doubtless down to Fincher's famous need for multiple retakes, which demonstrates his precision and perfectionism, though credit must also go to director of photography Darius Khondji, an Iranian-French cinematographer who gained an international reputation for his work on the French apocalyptic black comedy Delicatessen, directed by Jean-Pierre Jeunet. He was hired, against some amount of studio pushback, due to the strength of his earlier work, with Fincher recalling that he wanted to make the movie really beautiful at the same time that it was incredibly dystopian. He went on to say, quote, "The thing that Darius does so incredibly well is that he has a real sensitivity for how light falls on the human face. It's not difficult to make a room really dark and creepy looking, but it is difficult to figure out where the light is going to come from to hit that person who's moving through the dark, creepy room so that they have real weight and power." End quote. The photography is also more than enhanced by the stunning sets and art direction, courtesy of production designer Arthur Max and art director Gary Wisner, creating a landscape that is part urban decay and part hell on earth. However, it should also be said that one striking aspect of the film's appearance, the constant rain, was included more by necessity than design, even though the effect pays off handsomely. Once Brad Pitt was cast, the crew had a limited 55-day window before his next project, and this window happened to coincide with the arrival of El Niño in Los Angeles, where filming was taking place. The torrential rain that it brought with it created significant issues for continuity and required the use of water towers to replicate El Niño even when it wasn't raining. The result is highly effective, and it's hard to believe that this wasn't a conscious choice during pre-production, leaning in, as it does, to the film's overarching themes of the city being a hellhole of greed, depravity, and death. No wonder that Tracy is so keen to leave. Once Fincher was on board, the casting process began, and there were several actors in the frame at one point or another. Even before Fincher came on board, the film had been briefly attached to Denzel Washington, but he hadn't liked the script and had asked for multiple rewrites. Al Pacino had also turned the movie down, as had Gene Hackman, who was interested in the screenplay but declined due to the high number of night shoots. Eventually, the screenplay found its way to Brad Pitt, who at the time was suffering something of a career crisis. Although he had impressed audiences and critics with roles in Thelma and Louise, True Romance, and Interview with the Vampire, by 1994 he had, by his own admission, completely lost his sense of direction. Saying that he had had a few not-so-great experiences coming off a couple of films, he found himself checking out, waking up, immediately hitting a bong, drinking endless cans of Coke, and watching the O.J. Simpson trial, all whilst trying to work out what and where he should go next. At this point, his manager sent him the screenplay, accompanied by the words, "You've got to read this." Much like Fincher, the original few pages struck him as being more cliché than creative, but his manager encouraged him to read on, and by the time he got to the end, he was pretty much ready to sign on the dotted line. Fincher, for his part, called his friend and business partner at Propaganda Films, Dominic Senna, who had directed Pitt in the 1993 crime drama California. Receiving positive feedback about the actor, Fincher set up a meeting in an LA coffee shop, and following this, the contracts were signed within 48 hours. Pitt has subsequently recalled that during this meeting with Fincher, the director talked about films in a way in which he had never heard anybody else do, saying that the conversation completely reinvigorated him and that he essentially, quote, got the Jones back, end quote. And I think it's fair to say that Seven certainly contributed to the revival of Brad Pitt's career, particularly when combined with the double punch of Terry Gilliam's 12 Monkeys, which was released in the same year, and for which Pitt would receive his first Oscar nomination for Best Supporting Actor. Ironically enough, though, he lost out on this award to Kevin Spacey for his role in The Usual Suspects. The story regarding Kevin Spacey's casting in Seven is somewhat confusing and contradictory, and depends very much on who you choose to listen to. Spacey himself has gone on record saying that he was very much a last-minute decision and was only cast when an original actor dropped out. However, David Fincher and Brad Pitt remember things differently, saying that Spacey was in the frame for the role immediately from the moment that he auditioned, and recalled that they both fought hard for his inclusion, as New Line initially considered the actor's fees to be too high. It is, of course, completely up to you who you choose to believe, but in my opinion, Fincher and Pitt's version carries a little bit more weight, particularly when you consider that by the time the actor R. Lee Ermey auditioned for John Doe, Spacey was already Fincher's hard choice, and Ermey instead was offered the role of the Chief of Police. Morgan Freeman was suggested by producer Arnold Coppelson and was duly sent the screenplay. Much like his co-star and director, following his read-through he was ready to sign on, mainly because the character, according to the actor, was already fully there on the page. All that was missing was the manner in which the character would be filmed. He also appreciated the film's approach to violence, in that it depicted the aftermath rather than the crimes themselves, as well as the fact that Somerset, as the narrator, is the film's central driving force. This gave him what he called a fabulously powerful character to play, and with this in mind, signing up for him was pretty much a no-brainer. Finally, we have Gwyneth Paltrow, who at the time was not exactly a household name. This movie would mark her 7th feature film appearance, that is, if we don't count 3 TV movies, which we're not going to, because then we'd lose all sense of symmetry. As a lesser-known actress, she went through the standard casting process and was selected on the strength of her auditions and screen tests. Given her current status as the queen of all things goop, it's often hard to recall how talented she is, but I challenge anybody to watch the coffee shop discussion between she and Morgan Freeman and not be completely blown away by the sheer believability and vulnerability of her performance. On reflection, it's rather hard to imagine what the casting of Pitt, Freeman, Paltrow and Spacey would have cost even 2 years later. So to get all 4 for a horror thriller made on a budget of $33 million, modest by Hollywood standards, was really quite the coup, particularly when the film became a sleeper hit and earned its budget back tenfold, taking in over $327 million gross on its 1995 release. Not that anyone was particularly expecting that level of success. Test screenings were notoriously negative. In fact, Fincher has described them as disastrous, which is more a testament to the fallibility of movie marketing departments than it is to the film itself. Audiences had been drawn in by flyers, which name-checked Legends of the Fall and Driving Miss Daisy, and so were doubtless expecting something a little bit lighter compared to the bleak and soul-crushing experience that was projected on the screen. Many walked out following the Luss murder, and those who remained were simply appalled by the ending. And given that quite a few were possibly hoping for Driving Miss Daisy Part 2, it's completely understandable. But despite raking in scores so low that Fincher's ability to complete the project was called into question by more than one person, he still had the support of Michael DeLuca, who signed off on the final costs that were necessary to complete the filming. On its eventual release in 1995, the critical reviews were mixed, and many were extremely negative. We've already mentioned British film critic Barry Norman, and others were in agreement, with the gore being called excessive and gratuitous. There were also accusations that it took itself too seriously, while simultaneously lacking the intelligence of a film like The Silence of the Lambs, which is frankly laughable from my perspective. Whilst Freeman, Paltrow and Spacey were singled out for praise, Pitt's performance drew more than its fair share of criticism, with some suggesting that the part was underwritten, but also beyond his acting abilities, which is an oxymoron if ever I've heard one. Others, though, were far kinder, but even then the overall opinion was very much split down the middle. The same was also true of the critics' opinions on Fincher, with some extremely impressed by his style and craftsmanship, and others believing that he mistook darkness for profundity and that his style felt stretched when considered over the movie's entire runtime. Perhaps the most extreme comment came from Michael Medved of the New York Post, who claimed that the film was evil, causing Fincher to comment, quote, "I'm sure he slows down when he passes an accident like everybody else. Death fascinates people, but they don't deal with it." End quote. Given the nature of the film itself, it's probably not really surprising that it proved highly divisive, and to be honest, this is possibly no bad thing. As Oscar Wilde once said, quote, "I pity the book on which critics are agreed. It must be a very obvious and shallow production." End quote. I suspect that many people already know what happened to David Fincher, Brad Pitt, Morgan Freeman, and Gwyneth Paltrow following the film's release. So this week, I am just going to close this section by speaking about Andrew Kevin Walker. A few months before the release of Seven, for which he earned a BAFTA nomination, his adaptation of the Dean Koontz novel Hideaway also hit theatres, though this was not a huge success. Seven was followed in 1999 with 8mm, though Walker left the project due to multiple change requests from Joel Schumacher. He has gone on to say that he has still never seen the movie, and jokes that perhaps he will finally watch it when he is on his deathbed. Happily though, in the same year as 8mm, the film version of his screenplay for Sleepy Hollow, which was directed by Tim Burton, was released to much greater success. He also worked on uncredited rewrites for The Game, Event Horizon, Fight Club, and Stir of Echoes, and developed several scripts that seem to have remained in pre-production limbo, including two more for David Fincher, a remake of the 1970s occult thriller The Reincarnation of Peter Proud, and also the screenplay for The Girl Who Played with Fire. He followed this with the screenplay for the 2010 Benicio del Toro remake of The Wolfman, and also wrote a 2016 animated movie featuring Paul Rudd, which was called Nerdland. More recently, his screenplay adaptation of a French graphic novel, The Killer, was also directed by David Fincher and was released on Netflix in 2023. All of which brings us on to our second film of the week, which is Cure from 1997 and director Kiyoshi Kurosawa. This stars Kōji Yakusho, Anna Nakagawa, and Masato Hagiwara. Kiyoshi Kurosawa is possibly one of my favourite directors, with a filmography that includes Cure, Charisma, Seance, Pulse, Creepy, Chime, and Cloud. A list which suggests he only makes horror movies, and that all of these movies have one-word titles. However, whilst he has certainly made a significant number of impactful horror films, his filmography is far broader, covering police procedurals, science fiction, comedy, action films, and even softcore erotica, or pink films, as they are known in Japan. Since 1983, he has directed low-budget direct-to-video films, more than 30 features, and also TV dramas. He's also won numerous international film awards, including at Cannes, Venice, and Busan. Despite this, in the West at least, it is perhaps his horror cinema for which he is best known, with the New York Times stating that he is to psychological fright what David Cronenberg is to body horror. Of the genre to which his name is most attached, Kurosawa has said the following, quote, "One thing that I really feel, having made many films in this genre, is that when you really try to take it seriously, it becomes difficult to make something that the average person can enjoy. You'll make something very philosophical that the general public may not understand or enjoy. I always feel this way because we are forced to deal with death, something ultimately incomprehensible to the living. It's not a concept that's easy to communicate. This is why it is very difficult to make a simple and enjoyable film in this genre. The more serious and earnest I become, the more I realize that my films may only be understood by a certain type of person." End quote. All this being said, though, and in stark contrast to Fincher describing Seven as a horror film, Kurosawa says that Cure is not a horror movie, even if it is commonly categorized as one. And coincidentally, Kurosawa has claimed that it was the success of Seven that enabled him to make this film, saying that when he was trying to make the movie, he referenced Silence of the Lambs in his initial discussions with producers, only to be met with blank expressions and closed wallets, and that, quote, "It took 7 for me to be able to shoot it." End quote. Kiyoshi Kurosawa was born in Kobe, Japan in 1955, and had an interest in film from a very early age. But at the time he finished school, film programs and film schools in Japan were virtually non-existent. Up to the 1970s, major film companies had operated apprenticeship schemes to train would-be filmmakers, but all of these schemes came to an end in the mid-1970s as the industry went into sharp decline. With no educational opportunities to follow his passion, when it came time to go to university, he opted to study sociology at Rikyo University in Tokyo. On hearing this, it would be easy to assume that Kurosawa's films are informed by sociology. However, he says this is not the case. He has been quoted as saying that he pretty much forgot about the subject once his degree was completed. He has also said that reading horror films as a reflection of contemporary societal fears might be fashionable and might make horror palatable. The most important thing to him is to scare people. And that's possibly the first time I've been called fashionable in the last 30 years. Although there was no film program as such at Rikyo University, whilst there he did have the opportunity to take classes with a man often named as one of the greatest film theorists in the world, and this was a man called Shigehiko Hasumi. Here he was introduced to the work of directors including Don Siegel, Sam Peckinpah, Jean-Luc Godard, and Jean Cassavetes, and according to Kurosawa, this entire experience changed his life. Quote, "What he taught me was how to watch films, how to perceive them, not how to make them. How to make them is very much self-taught. The core of what he taught me is that films just aren't about entertainment, but they are so vital and exciting that they are worth spending your whole life exploring and examining." End quote. As well as the directors just mentioned, in his 1992 book, The Charisma of the Image, Kurosawa has also cited several directors as being an influence on his work. These include Tobe Hooper, Wim Wenders, David Cronenberg, John Carpenter, Alfred Hitchcock, and Steven Spielberg. He has also expressed an admiration for the early films of Italian director Mario Bava, and also the 1955 French thriller Les Diaboliques, which was directed by Henri-Georges Clouzot, and which he homages in Cure with the appearance of a red dress in the dry cleaners. Whilst he was at university, a phenomena known as self-produced film came to prominence in Japan. These were 8mm self-produced films made by people with their own time, money and ideas, and by the late 1970s a significant number had been made by young would-be directors. And of course Kurosawa was no exception to this, making self-produced films and essentially training himself in the art of filmmaking. These films were mostly shorts, initially, and included the self-explanatory Violent Teacher, Great Massacre in Broad Daylight, and in 1976, A Record of an Uncertain Trip, and the rather Andy Warhol-esque sounding Traffic Signal Blinking Again. Eventually, he went on to self-produce a much longer film, which lasted for roughly an hour, called Vertigo College, a Yakuza comedy that was selected for the Pia Film Festival, or PFF. This was a showcase for the work of young directors, and as such it became something of a magnet for young cinephiles. The success of Vertigo College at this festival led to his first professional filmmaking job, working as an assistant director to Shinji Samai on the Yakuza comedy film Sailor Suit and Machine Gun, which went on to become the biggest Japanese movie of 1981. From here, Kurosawa moved into an area that, at the time, acted as a training ground for many Japanese filmmakers, pink films. These were essentially softcore erotica that were filmed against a set of industry-dictated standards, a short running length, low budget, tight turnaround, and of course, lots of sex scenes. And as long as those rules were adhered to, directors could pretty much do whatever they wanted. His first pink movie was called Nakagawa Wars, which he followed with a film titled The Excitement of the Do-Re-Mi-Fa Girl, though it started with a far more simple title of College Girl Shameful Summer. This was produced by a studio called Nikatsu Films, who, it must be said, were less than happy with the final version that Kurosawa submitted, which by all accounts was rather light on the sex and much heavier on philosophy and experimental filmmaking techniques. Nikatsu Films refused to release it, so Kurosawa, with the help of director Shinji Samai, bought the film from the studio, shot some additional sequences, re-edited it, and released it under the longer and, let's be honest, Julie Andrews sounding title. I've seen neither of these pink movies, so can't say much more about them, but fortuitously, at this stage, he moved on from pink films and into the world of horror, though his next film would not be without its controversies, most of which occurred behind the camera. This film was 1989's Sweet Home, a haunted house movie produced by Huzo Itami, the most commercially successful director in Japanese cinema at the time. It has long been rumoured that Itami should hold the true directing credit, and Kurosawa himself has said that he had very little control over the film, and that while he was credited as director, it was Itami who held the real power on set. Incidentally, this movie has been cited as the main influence on the video game series Resident Evil, and therefore an influence on the entire survival horror video game genre, and there are several videos on YouTube that describe how it came about, and I'll link these in the show notes. Producer Itami's power over the film manifested itself in his decision to re-edit and reshoot parts of Sweet Home for the home video market, something that he did without Kurosawa's consent. As a result, in an unprecedented move for the film industry of the time, Kurosawa sued Itami and his production company, leading to a very public legal battle that he not only lost, but which effectively led to his being blacklisted from the Japanese film industry for several years. Unable to secure funding for mainstream theatrical releases, he was effectively forced into a 3-year hiatus, during which time he made direct-to-video movies, known as V-cinema, and also taught film. He has referred to this period as, quote, "a time I was considered kind of a dangerous character within the studio system, kind of persona non grata that couldn't be relied on to deliver what they wanted. At the same time, there were young people and critics who supported my idiosyncratic approach to filmmaking and who really supported my work. At this point, it's hard to say whether it was a good experience or a bad experience, but the way I like to think of myself is that I somehow bridge the distance between a creative filmmaker and a craftsperson who can deliver a commercial film. I like to think of myself as somewhere in between the two." End quote. And this idiosyncratic approach can certainly be seen in his 1992 low-budget slasher, The Guard from Underground, which started to mark the beginning of a comeback. The Guard from Underground, which at the time of recording is currently available on Shudder, is a strangely compelling corporate satire slasher hybrid, with an energy and creativity that, in my opinion, is far superior to many better-known slasher movies. It's extremely strange, and at points rather nonsensical, but within it you can certainly see the traces of the artist that Kurosawa would become. Featuring a truly eye-watering kill sequence about halfway through, it's definitely worth a watch, and I say that as somebody who's really not the biggest fan of the slasher genre, though I guess this is way more off-kilter than most. On its release, it proved very popular, and was chosen as the 10th best film at the 1993 Japan Film Professional Awards. As well as the 1992 release of The Guard from Underground, in the same year Kurosawa was invited to attend the Sundance Institute Screenwriters Lab in the US. This invite and associated bursary was extended following the submission of his own original screenplay, Charisma, a film that he would eventually make in 1999. He has described this period as a special and precious time, one which exposed him to the international film community, but which also showed him the difference between Japanese and American filmmaking. Regardless of the differences, though, many of his films, Cure included, do take some inspiration from American genre cinema, which is probably no surprise given the earlier list of his influences. Returning to Japan, he continued to make V-films, including Suit Yourself or Shoot Yourself, parts 1 to 5, The Revenge, parts 1 and 2, and a return to horror with Door 3, the third entry in a series of films that have very little in common other than the fact that they involve, surprise surprise, doors. The first, released in 1988, tells of a girl menaced by a door-to-door salesman. The second, released in 1991, concerns a high-class sex worker and is possibly far heavier on the sex than it is the horror. The third, Kurosawa's own entry, follows an insurance saleswoman stalked by a mysterious client and was released in 1996. Working in V-cinema taught him an efficient filmmaking style, and also, as digital filmmaking had yet to emerge, the importance of saving precious film stock. This, he later said, informed his filmmaking style, particularly his use of long single takes, which is of course a direct contrast to the style adopted by directors like David Fincher. And then, in 1997, he would release the film that, while not a financial success at the time, has subsequently been lauded as one of the greatest Japanese horror films of all time. And this, of course, is Cure. And now we are getting into the spoilers, and I'm going to talk about the ending of the film, so all of my usual warnings apply from here on in. Cure tells the story of a detective, Kenichi Takabe, played by frequent collaborator Kōji Yakusho. Takabe is investigating a series of unexplained murders, all committed by different and seemingly unconnected people, all of whom, we are told, admit intent, but then say afterwards that they were stunned. Each victim has the symbol of the letter X carved into their throats, linking the corpses, if not the murderers. While the police psychiatrist suggests that most crimes have no meaning and that these killings just happened, Takabe is not convinced. From here we go into the investigation, a journey that takes several unusual turns and moves away from the standard police procedural and into very, very different territory. It transpires that each of the killers do indeed have a connection. They have each interacted, albeit briefly, with a mysterious figure who we learn is possibly called Mamiya, who is played by the charismatic actor Masato Hagiwara. Mamiya is an amnesiac, or at least he claims to be, and more than that, appears to be gifted in hypnosis. It is through these interactions that Mamiya directs each murder, though whether he is directing the killing or simply removing the social norms that prevent people from killing is left ambiguous. And while this distinction ultimately makes very little difference to the victims, this ambiguity forms the backbone of the film, and indeed of much of Kurosawa's work. During the film, the psychiatrist Sakuma states that hypnosis cannot change the moral sensibilities of the subject, and that it is impossible to induce the act of murder in somebody who fundamentally believes that killing is evil. This opens up the possibility that the film is about suppressed violence and suppressed emotion, and that the cure suggested by the title is the removal of that very suppression, the moral checks and balances that hold our natural inclinations at bay. This is most clearly illustrated by the scene in which Mamiya hypnotizes his female doctor, who then goes on to commit possibly the grisliest murder in the movie, eventually peeling off a dead man's face in a very bloody and quite wince-inducing form of dissection. During the hypnosis scene, Mamiya makes suggestions about her role as a woman in Japanese society, as well as references to her sexual awakening and also to death, suggesting that she became a surgeon because all she really wanted to do was cut a man open, which, as we have just heard, she later does. This has been elaborated by the writer Anton Bittel and requoted in the book Cure by Dominic Lash. Bittel suggests that almost everyone who meets Mamiya proves open to his suggestion, and that all Mamiya does with his subjects is bring out what is already within. This is also captured by Kurosawa's use of long, uninterrupted single shots, something that we see in many of his films, but which seems to be at its most powerful here. This stylistic choice, he says, is to, quote, capture the moment from a normal state to a strange state without breaking it up into cuts. And rather than things changing suddenly, it's more like something that was already there becomes exposed, a feeling of ambiguous drift and transition. This approach is, of course, in direct contrast to the multi-take approach favoured by Fincher. Kurosawa has very few rehearsals, and, in his own words, keeps filming without stopping the scene. He keeps going until the end, and then moves on to the next scene. Although this is indeed a highly effective style choice, he has said it stems from his days of making V-cinema and his need to save film stock, and also that he likes to work 9 to 5 like anyone else, something for which I am sure his actors and crew must be grateful, despite the challenges that long continuous takes must bring. Lead actor Kōji Yakusho has commented on this, saying that this approach is indeed challenging, but that it allows the actor to build on their emotions, and also ensures that the audience sees every expression and every second of character development. The casting of Kōji Yakusho was indeed a very serendipitous one, as following Cure, the two would go on to work together on several films. At the time that Kurosawa was writing the script, in the early 90s, he had already considered Yakusho as the ideal actor for the role, though he doubted that the actor, who had appeared in far more successful films, would be either available or interested. It was only when the two were introduced by fellow director Masayuki So that the opportunity presented itself. Even then, Kurosawa was surprised when the actor accepted the part, something that he described as a dream come true. He has described Yakusho as somebody who creates an atmosphere from the second he appears on screen, possessing an ability to set audience expectations as to what might happen in the movie. At the same time, he says, Yakusho also presents, in what would appear to be the only adjective to describe Kurosawa's work, a sense of great ambiguity. Interestingly, for his part, Yakusho himself had long been an admirer of the director's work, and had never believed that he would be offered the opportunity to work with him. As I mentioned, following this, the two would continue to work together on many films, including Pulse, Retribution, Doppelganger, Charisma, and Seance. The long takes and minimal cuts also do far more than we have already discussed. They are also responsible for creating a sense of dread in the viewer, as in the moment we first see Mamiya on the beach, heralded by a dark cloud crossing the sand. They also provide the film's most shocking moments, shocking because they are neither signposted nor accompanied by a conventional score. A body flies through a window to land on the ground. A calm exterior of a police station becomes the scene of a shooting at point-blank range, both events presented in a matter-of-fact documentary style and becoming all the more shocking because of it. The same can also be said of the scene where we find the doctor placidly dissecting a man on the floor of a public bathroom. With the exception of some deliberately and ironically upbeat piano music, the score is lean and spare, with amplified diegetic sounds, such as the dripping of water or the flickering of a neon tube, all underscored with ominous rumblings, creating greater unease than the usual orchestral stings that we expect in both the horror and thriller genres. Kurosawa has described this as wanting to avoid restricting himself to sound elements that are required purely to move the story along, or even to the diegetic sounds that I have just mentioned. His sense is that there is a world beyond that which we are seeing before us, and that the sounds in his films are an echo or reflection from that world which lies beyond the corners of the screen. But despite all my assertions that the theme of the movie is that we all have violence within us, I have to admit that this analysis is just one perspective, and as with much of Kurosawa's work, Cure raises more questions than it answers, a deliberate strategy that some may find frustrating, but which is entirely the director's intention. What I want to accomplish with my films, he says, is to leave the audience to come up with the answers, and this is most certainly the case here. In fact, discussing the film at the 2013 Tokyo Film Festival, he claimed not to have many of the answers himself, something that lead actor Yakusho found challenging when asking him about the character's motivations. Both have recalled numerous conversations where the actor would ask about dialogue, scenes, and the cause and effect that would lead to lines of dialogue being spoken, but the response from the director was always ambiguous, because, as Kurosawa himself has said, he didn't really know the answer either. This is not, though, just a willful desire to be obtuse, but is instead a worldview, and also goes some way to outlining his perspective on the role of the director, saying, quote, "I never intentionally make ambiguous that which should be clear. Certainly, my understanding of film is that the story is an element of the film, but it's very much about portraying a reality, a world that exists beyond the screen. I think you would have to agree that our encounters with reality can sometimes be clear and unambiguous, but more often they are confoundingly complex, and the meaning of events that unfold before us can often elude comprehension forever. So, when I make my films, I am not the all-seeing, omniscient God explaining to the audience what has happened and why. You should just think of my movies as a string of scenes of pondering what I would do and how I would face the events unfolding before my eyes. The reality that I find incomprehensible and confounding, I present exactly to you how I encounter it myself. That's the approach that I take to movie making. The reality with which he confronts us in Cure would seem, in part at least, to stem from an interest in real-life murder cases, where killers who have committed atrocities have passed by undetected. In an interview for the Masters of Cinema Blu-ray release of the film from Eureka Entertainment, he expands on this further, saying, quote, "A long time ago, I was watching news coverage of a murderer on television when he was caught for his crime, and the murderer's neighbours were interviewed, and they were showing on television as well. He was just a normal person. He was a nice man. Why did he commit such a crime?" They all said things like that. And the news commentator was saying that under the guise of an ordinary, normal person, a dangerous murderer had been hiding in the neighbourhood. That's how he explained it. When I saw that on television, I thought maybe that wasn't the case. Maybe he wasn't this dangerous murderer in the beginning who had been pretending to be a normal person. Rather, he was a nice, normal person to begin with, but something triggered him and he committed murder. I thought that might be a more accurate interpretation. So, being skeptical of the coverage was a major inspiration for making this movie." End quote. The title of the film was originally to be Evangelist. However, this was changed following the 1995 sarin gas attack on the Tokyo Underground, and a concern that the title was far too close to the religious fervour of the terrorist group responsible. The title Cure was suggested by a producer at the production company, which, given the themes of the film, I have to say feels more appropriate, and also spins the narrative into intriguing, if somewhat oblique directions. Although Kurosawa has said that he borrowed genre styles and conventions from American cinema, particularly the conversations between Hannibal Lecter and Clarice Starling in The Silence of the Lambs, the film is more than just a procedural crime investigation. In American films, he says, with Seven being a possible exception, the detective very often does not change throughout the film. In this film, however, the film is less policier and more a portrait of the lead detective, a man who may be a good guy, may be a bad guy, but who goes on a transformation across the duration of the narrative nonetheless. His wife, Fume, played by Anna Nakagawa, is suffering from a severe mental illness, one that ultimately leads to her hospitalization, and it is possible that the weight of this responsibility has led to the detective's own deterioration. And although this may be a rather reductive perspective, it would at least account for the hallucination that she has hanged herself, a jaw-dropping moment that comes at the midpoint of the film, and from which it took me a minute or two to recover. Intriguingly, in an early draft of the screenplay, the character of Fume does not appear at all, and her presence was instead suggested through the sound of a washing machine and through one-sided dialogue delivered by Takabe to an unseen figure off-screen, who may or may not have existed at all. This was changed during the script development process, and I have to say, in my opinion, it's probably a good thing it was. The presence of Fume adds a depth to both the film and to Takabe's character, and to have him possibly hallucinating her throughout the movie may have pushed the narrative a little too far into crazy cop territory. She is also the first character that we meet in the film, undergoing therapy at a psychiatrist's office, which sets up several of the film's key themes. She is reading an analysis of the fairy tale Bluebeard, a story which concerns a wife whose husband hides a deadly secret, something which possibly points to the nature of her relationship with her husband. The idea of secret identities and hidden knowledge that leads to death is fundamental to the film, as is the sudden trembling that occurs, shaking the table and the items upon it. This is caused by Fume unconsciously shaking her leg against the table, but also suggests that what is apparently still and quiet can be disrupted at any moment. However, importantly, it is we ourselves who cause the disruption. It is people that cause the chaos in this story. I am also grateful to writer Dominic Lash for translating the doctor's notes about Fume, which are, as he points out, written in German, despite the doctor being Japanese. These state that Fume is suffering from a variety of psychological disorders, including seizures, heightened sensitivity, changes of mood and behaviour, distraction, disorientation, and temporary retrograde amnesia. These too point to themes of the film. Antagonist Mamiya is also amnesiac, and the idea of mental collapse and disorientation is one that we see not only in Fume and in the actions of the various murderers, but also in a customer in the dry cleaners, who mutters to himself in a way that suggests that he too is suffering from psychological illness, or perhaps a barely repressed rage. The idea of amnesia, of course, also leads into the theme of identity, something that is echoed by Mamiya's request of his subjects to tell him about themselves. Mamiya claims to not know who he is. Fume suffers from retrograde amnesia. The various hypnotized victims act in ways that seem out of character, but are most likely not, and our main protagonist seems to morph into somebody very different by the end of the movie. For Kurosawa, the concept of identity itself is rather opaque, and is something about which he has always been sceptical, pointing out that a person at work is different from who they are at home, and that people change depending on who they are with and the circumstances in which they find themselves. In an interview on the Eureka Entertainment Blu-ray, he expands on this further, saying, quote, "As time passes, you'll be a slightly different person tomorrow compared to today. At each point in time, you believe that the person is who you are, your identity. But there's an inconsistency. When you compare who this person is at different points in time, you would see many different aspects of yourself that you weren't aware of. But nevertheless, you consider them all as one person. That's why we see people in Cure, including the main character, displaying different personas as situations change. They're unlike the characters usually seen in films. They don't have clear-cut identities. They don't have easily discernible personalities. But from my point of view, that's more natural as a human being." End quote. And so, as the film progresses, we certainly see Detective Takabe change, something that is foreshadowed by a shot of his face slippering in and out of shadow, courtesy of a flickering subway light. Whether he is sympathetic or not remains unclear until the very end, when he is effectively quote-unquote cured of his issues through the killing of Mamiya and, it would appear, the adoption of his hypnotic modus operandi. Much like Seven, in Cure the antagonist is captured early, a seemingly deliberate ploy that allows him to extend his reach to the officers around him and the lead detective. And much like Seven, he seems in quite passive acceptance that this will lead to his own demise. But while John Doe taps into a minor flaw in Mill's character, his inability to regulate his temper, Mamiya taps into something far deeper, and the impact that he has on Takabe is perhaps far more longer-lasting. At the end of the film, Takabe finishes his food at a restaurant, something that he has been unable to do until this point. He appears calm and assured, all while a waitress picks up a butcher's knife to, one assumes, go and murder her boss. This, for me at least, gives credence to the notion that we all have a killer inside, and that all that is needed is a trigger to set us off. After all, it seemed a natural thing to do is the only explanation that each of the killers can provide. Cure opened in Japan in 1997, 1 year before the global explosion in so-called J-horror initiated by Hideo Nakata's Ringu in 1998, and then a year later with Takeshi Miike's Audition. Because of this, it was not as successful as one might expect, though over time its significance and importance have grown, and it is now rightly seen as the harbinger of the Japanese horror explosion. For many, it is Kurosawa's best work, and it is now rightly lauded as one of the most powerful films of the era. Ari Aster, the director of Hereditary and Midsommar, has argued that Cure could be described as the greatest movie ever made, while Martin Scorsese has called it the director's most terrifying film, going on to say, quote, "It is not for the faint of heart, but be brave, because it's worth it. Kurosawa is a major filmmaker." End quote. And indeed, as a major filmmaker, Kurosawa has gone on to direct across a wide range of genre since the release of this movie, and remains remarkably prolific, having directed more than 25 films in the following years, not to mention shorts, TV series, and videos. We will be covering many more of his movies over the coming year, so stand by for further excessive use of the words ambiguous, beautiful, and deeply disturbing. Seven and Cure, on the surface, are both police procedurals, but both play with the conventions and tropes of the genre to confound audience expectations and create worlds in which anything can, and indeed does, happen. But thematically and stylistically, the two films are polar opposites. The first uses multiple takes, fast editing, and a combination of frenetic and fluid camera work to disturb and disorientate the viewer, while the second uses long single shots and stillness to build a sense of increasing dread. In Seven, ever-present violence is on the surface, seen on the streets every day, in a world that, for all intents and purposes, seems like a hell on earth, birthing a killer who wishes to punish the guilty to make his own way to heaven. In Cure, in my opinion at least, the calm surface masks suppressed rage and violence, with an antagonist who seeks to liberate the guilty by allowing them to give way to their hidden desires. Put together, both films present a view of the world that is losing its sanity and descending into violence, just at different rates and with different execution. And while they may not be as directly connected in the way that some of the films in this series have been, in their opposing styles and thematic concerns, they are highly complementary, even if you may need a lie down in a dark room for a while after watching them. All of which brings me to the end of this week's episode, which, despite my best efforts, I really think isn't that much shorter than last week's. I do promise, though, to try to do better moving forward. As always, if you've enjoyed this episode, please remember to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. It really helps with the algorithm and therefore helps introduce the show to new listeners. You can also write to the show at thehorrordouble@gmail.com, and remember you can follow us on Instagram at thehorrordouble. So, after all of the chaos of the last 2 weeks, next week we're going to have a nice, quiet, relaxing trip to the theatre, though relaxing is probably pushing it a little bit too far. First up, we have Theatre of Blood from 1973, directed by Douglas Hickox and starring Vincent Price, Diana Rigg, Ian Hendry, and a whole cast of great British character actors. Then we're following this with a trip back to Italy, with Stage Fright from 1987, directed by Michele Soave and starring Barbara Capisti, David Brandon, and Giovanni Lombardo Radice. And if you want to watch along and are in the UK, Theatre of Blood is currently available on Amazon Prime Video and Apple TV, while Stage Fright is currently available on Amazon Prime. So, I'll be back next Sunday for the discussion, and until then, thank you once again for listening, and have a really great week. Goodbye.